Since the early 20th century, specialized United States Army units have provided our nation with unique capabilities to accomplish military and national objectives. These special units and their functions developed over time until eventually coming under the administrative control of what is now known as the United States Army Special Operations Command. USASOC has served as the higher headquarters for our Army Special Operations Forces since December of 1989. But how did USASOC and its elite RSOF units get to where they are today? For that, we will travel back to the world wars of the early 20th century. After the United States entered World War I in 1917, it mobilized and deployed hundreds of thousands of American soldiers to fight in Europe. During the war, the U.S. Army conducted combat propaganda operations for the first time in its history. This experience established a foundation for Army psychological operations as we now know it. Immediately following the war, U.S. forces remained in Europe to oversee German demobilization and disarmament. Lessons learned from these military government efforts provided a guide for later Army civil affairs operations. These early instances of psychological operations and civil affairs were shut down once their war efforts were complete. Unknown at the time, these functions would be needed again when the United States was thrust into another world war 2 decades later. Less than 25 years after the 1918 armistice, the United States was again at war, joining its allies in the fight against the Axis powers. Drawn into the war by Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the U.S. Army quickly realized that winning this war would require innovation and audacity. To this end, specialized units were created to conduct unconventional warfare, psychological warfare, commando missions, strategic reconnaissance, and civil affairs operations. Among these units were RSOF predecessors such as the 1st Special Service Force, Ranger Battalions, psychological warfare and civil affairs units, long-range penetration units, and Philippine guerrilla advisors. Army personnel also served in the Wartime Office of Strategic Services, a joint special operations and intelligence service that influenced the development of Army special operations after the war. Following the Allied victories in 1945, the Army again performed occupation duties through its civil affairs units, helping to transition former enemies into allies. While the wartime special operations units were deactivated after the war, many of the lessons learned from those operations lived on through the veterans from those units, who helped establish doctrine and training programs for future RSOF operations. After World War II, the Cold War between the United States, the Soviet Union, and their respective allies dominated international affairs for the next 45 years. While direct conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union was avoided during this era, the period was characterized by political tension, ideological differences, an arms race, and proxy wars in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. It was critical that the United States enhance its conventional, nuclear, and special operations capabilities to limit the spread of communism while deterring another world war. Forward-thinking Army leaders recognized the need for standing special operations forces in the late 1940s, but progress was slow until the early 1950s, when the Korean War added urgency to their efforts. The United States was initially caught off guard by North Korea's invasion of South Korea in June of 1950, but U.S. forces quickly came to the aid of its ally under the United Nations banner. During the ensuing 3-year conflict, the Army re-established many of the special operations capabilities it had neglected since the end of World War II. These included Ranger Infantry Companies, a Guerrilla Advisory Command, and Psy-War and Civil Affairs units. In 1952, with war still raging in Korea, the Army took two actions with far-reaching impacts for Army Special Operations. First, it established the Psy-War Center and School at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, to serve as the proponent for Psy-War and unconventional warfare training and doctrine. As Special Operations doctrine evolved, Psy-War and unconventional warfare provided the basis for what became known as special warfare. The Psy-War Center was renamed the U.S. Army Special Warfare Center and School in 1956. Second, they recognized the need for a dedicated unconventional warfare capability. For this, the Army activated the 10th Special Forces Group in 1952 and placed it under the command of the Psy-War Center. Although Special Forces did not play a large role in the Korean War, they would feature prominently in the next flare-up of the Cold War, in a place called Vietnam. In the early 1960s, special warfare gained a prominent new advocate in President John F. Kennedy, who embraced it as a way to address the challenges of communist-inspired wars of national liberation.
This is another type of warfare, new in its intensity, ancient in its origin, war by guerrillas, subversives, insurgents, assassins, war by ambush instead of by combat, by infiltration instead of aggression, seeking victory by eroding and exhausting the enemy instead of engaging him. It is a form of warfare uniquely adapted to what has been strangely called wars of liberation.
To this end, Special Warfare Mobile Training Teams, or MTTs, deployed to locations around the globe to train and assist partner nations fighting against communist forces. Southeast Asia was of particular concern due to growing communist insurgencies in Laos and South Vietnam. Despite intensive Special Forces advisory efforts, South Vietnam's insurgency escalated into a full-scale war by the mid-1960s. This conflict required the full range of the Army's special operations capabilities. In addition to training, advising, and leading indigenous Vietnamese forces, various Army Special Operations units conducted strategic reconnaissance, long-range patrols, personnel rescue and recovery, psychological operations, and civil affairs. Although ARSOF soldiers served with exceptional valor in Vietnam, just as they had in previous wars, the Army prioritized conventional warfighting after Vietnam. As a result, active-duty Special Operations units endured significant force reductions and lack of funding for the remainder of the 1970s. It would take a disaster in a Middle Eastern desert to reverse this trend. It was Operation Eagle Claw, the failed military attempt to rescue American hostages in Iran in April 1980, that revealed serious problems in the nation's ability to conduct joint and special operations activities. With congressional support, the Department of Defense established several new headquarters to better manage, resource, and coordinate special operations activities. The first of these new commands was the Joint Special Operations Command at Fort Bragg in 1980. Within the Army, the first Special Operations Command was activated in 1983 at Fort Bragg as the higher headquarters for Special Forces, Rangers, PSYOP, and Civil Affairs units, marking the first time all of these Army Special Operations forces had been brought under the same command. They were soon joined by such new units as the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the 528th Support Battalion, and the 112th Signal Battalion. To address the requirement for unified command and control of Special Operations Forces across the Department of Defense, the United States Special Operations Command was officially activated at MacDill Air Force Base, Florida, in 1987. Finally, in December of 1989, the Army's first Special Operations Command was replaced by the United States Army Special Operations Command and assumed responsibility for all U.S. Army Special Operations Forces. With the fall of the Berlin Wall that same year and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the Cold War was effectively over. RSOF shifted their focus to promoting democracy, conducting humanitarian operations, training host nation forces, and interdicting warlords, drug traffickers, and international terrorists. While the end of the Cold War brought a sense of victory, the ensuing years witnessed many high-profile terrorist strikes against American citizens and interests. These culminated in the devastating September 11, 2001 attacks that cost nearly 3,000 American lives and thrust the United States into the global war on terrorism.
Today, we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
From then on, RSOF soldiers have conducted the full range of irregular warfare activities while serving on the front line against violent extremist organizations around the globe, protecting the nation from similar attacks. Over the last 2 decades, the U.S. Army John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center and School has adapted its training to meet the rapidly evolving requirements of the modern battlefield, while USASOC has expanded to meet increased demands. Today, RSOF are the nation's premier irregular warfare experts and a critical part of the joint force, operating and building partnerships in dozens of countries at any one time. The men and women of Army Special Operations stand ready to deter and defeat strategic threats to the United States. RSOF soldiers uphold the rich tradition of innovation, tenacity, and heroism that America has come to expect of its Special Operations warriors.